with today's agenda. So welcome, first governance call of December, hard to believe. And one of the items I think on the agenda today is kind of come up from kind of our prior governance calls in November that we thought, well, maybe this is the time to start digging into it. And then other items that we've got on the agenda today are more oriented around like kind of prep for the 1.2 and 2.0 release, with the goal of effectively like getting any of the changes in that, we've said we've, from a governance perspective, approved, and just need to see them reflected in the spec, ideally in before the holiday break. So I've got these two items with that maybe we'll get around to. This is kind of like our grab list, but for the most part, I think today a focus on following up on the topic around like how do another country's base and core relate to each other. That came out of some of our previous discussions around like how do we manage our total list of profiles now that we've been removing things like goal and smoking status and things that like maybe are less relevant and more use case specific. So that's what I have on like our agenda for today. Was there anything that folks wanted to see added or that that we want to see prioritized? If not, I'll probably start by just framing this a little bit in the context of our past discussion for anyone that previously missed it. So, we had, right after discussing and agreeing on the removal of goal, we started to have some questions around like, well, how should we be looking at our profiling list, particularly where, like, if we were going to be introducing new profiles or removing profiles in the future, keeping that in sync and understanding the relationship between the profile list that we would anticipate from CA core, from the, that would be kind of drilled up through from CA CDI versus the larger set of modeling that might be present in PCH DCF. And so we had a pretty good discussion on our last governance call about like, well, we think based on the like our core principles, it may not be as simple as, well, PCH DCF equals base and CA CDI equals core. In that, our goal is always to be kind of scoped at the kind of highest level to represent, Canadian context, but that to be largely use case agnostic, which, PCH DCF and CA CDI aren't necessarily use case agnostic in that same vein. And so we talked about like, what is that sweet spot that provides value, while also not necessarily like playing this role that is heavily enforced, like that would drive underlying changes in behaviors compared to current state. And so what we said was, well, we don't have the answer today, right? In terms of what that sweet spot is. Particularly in terms of like proactive planning on, when do we introduce new profiles and how do we maintain our the list over time. But we all felt that reviewing, another country's approach, particularly to maintaining a base and a core, would be helpful in kind of informing what we want our kind of future state to look like in the baseline as core is developed and as, we see more and more kind of use case specific guides enter into this sphere. And so that's kind of how the topic came about. What kind of our goals, I think, as a starting point, looking at base and core, are probably largely going to be oriented around like doing this initial scan. I jotted down some ideas, but I thought maybe we could also like add to them. We're specifically looking at, how does another country's base and core, like what are the distinctions in their guidance in one versus the other on their purpose, how they're utilized by implementers, how conformance expectations are outlined, in consideration of how the topic came about. Like, I think it probably makes sense to look to see like, are their profile lists always exactly the same? Does one have more than the other? Do they have different focuses? There is the tried and true, how do they approach actual profiling and conformance expectations differently, right? So applying constraints, how is that different in the base versus the core? Their approach to extensions and terminology, and then how do they leverage each other? So what is the relationship between the two mechanically, and how are they leveraged by other Australian guides, ones that are like more use case specific? Are there other things like when we're going through side by side, the Australian base and the Australian core, that we want to specifically be scanning for to help kind of inform we think this is what makes up the baseline sweet spot in our current context? Or does it make sense to kind of start with this and kind of see what we're finding as we're coming along, to see if like there's specific patterns that they call out that we'd similarly have to make decisions on? Quiet bunch, no opinions one way or the other. Okay. Well, I think we'll kind of start by anchoring ourselves here and look at it together, and kind of add on as we want to dig into different sections of the guide. So I have actually pulled up, it's going to be useful for folks to be able to see this side by side, like let me see if it's going to let me do this. Maybe not, 1 second. Like the equivalent pages side by side. So I've got AU base introduction on the left, and then the AU core introduction on the right, with the idea of like, this would be a page that helps us understand the kind of purpose and context and use, but like differences between the two. Is this big enough for folks?
Yep.
Okay. Important thing to note, and like, I think it's something that we should keep in the back of our minds, in terms of why maybe we're seeing some of like the patterns that we are, the harmonization that we are. But it's important to note that both the base and the core are authored and stewarded by the same organization, right? Oftentimes I think that the same team that works on as editors is like one for one. And so like, I kind of almost see this as like in a completely controlled environment, what could a base and core look like, where, the same people are working across the same specs and have like likely the same maintenance schedules. And I think that can kind of be an ideal state, but also when we are going to make kind of our own proposals and decisions, something that we should consider, where it's like, we might have to do a little bit more thinking around what that relationship looks like when we have a different maintenance cycle and a different set of stewards and a different set of approvers, or contribution processes and workflows. So just something to put out there, that we'll have to consider, but that probably will make this an easier comparison than a base and a core that are defined more distinctly by different parties. And as far as I know, like, there really aren't that many, I haven't done a scan in a while, but that many countries that have like an established publication of like base and core together yet. Primarily Australia is leading the charge. There are some that have like regional core with national core, or different variations of that, but at least we kind of have a cookie cutter to compare against. So if I'm looking on the left, which is the base, I see Australian realm concepts, options of what is available as an additional set of options to what is available in this FHIR standard. And they call out extensions, terminologies, and identifiers. Here we've got minimum expectations on FHIR resources to support conformance and implementation in systems, data model and RESTful API, set minimum expectations for a system to record, update, search, and retrieve. So there's already a bit of a use case and a flavor of kind of enforcement and conformance that we're seeing on the right compared to optioning on top of the base standard to reflect realm extensions, realm terminology, and realm identifiers in the base. Inform a reader of what added concepts are considered relevant for a particular resource type. Base profiles may be further constrained for particular usage. For this reason, does not apply concordinality strengths or required binding strengths to added concept except in rare circumstances, and does not utilize must support flags or recommend or mandate any particular resource element or interactions. So there's a bunch in that statement, which basically to say, like, if the core says, here's the minimum type of interactions, element expectations, constraints, things like required or mandated terminology or concepts. The Australian base basically says almost this is definitional as opposed to constraint based. And we've talked about that a little bit in the past in our discussions about whether or not we should be keeping must support around. Does that surprise anybody? Like those two distinctions?
What I would kind of expect to see.
Brandy, you said it's kind of what you expected?
Yeah.
Yeah, we
And
can
then-
barely hear you.
Yeah, it was just a little quiet. And then the second piece. Okay, well, actually, let's look at the rest of the base before we do the comparison on the core. So guide alone doesn't constrain them sufficiently to ensure implementation use cases can be met. That makes sense given what we're hearing above. Defines okay, so this is a little bit about core, and then they've got a little bit about base here. So core defines conformance requirements that enforce a minimum requirements on Australian localized concepts from the US or AU base through cardinality constraints must support required binding strengths and capability. So basically, like, AU core enforces the localized concepts through the mechanisms available to it from profiling. Available when implementing FHIR, provide a common implementation, this would be core, built on top of when creating additional profiles, Australian profiles and implementation guide. Conformance to AU core may be tied to regulatory and contractual agreements in order to necessitate adoption for this prescriptive specification. That sounds very similar to what we had originally put out in our guide, but we were describing the difference between kind of base and core, which was very much oriented around like regulatory requirements and mechanisms for enforcement. I'm guessing we're going to see something similar on here when talking about AU base. So uses AU base representations where available as the basis for profiles that define the FHIR resources, elements, extensions, vocab that shall be present. Hold on. And the elements and value sets that shall be present are identified and how they are used and defined. As the basis for profiles. Okay, so I think what they're saying is, as the basis for CA core profiles that have this, as the basis for AU core profiles that have this purpose of defining how the FHIR resources should be supported, what the vocabulary shall be, and how they're supposed to be used. I'm thinking this is base also, or it also documents minimum RESTful interactions for how to access data. So again, this is a statement about core, promotes interoperability and adoption through common implementation, and should be the basis of further implementation guide development for specific cases. So this is interesting because to me, I read this as like the expectation is that base or core is informed by base, and that implementation guides like are informed by core. And so in that sense, like implementation guides get at base rules because they've been co-adopted in core. I don't know, do other people read those two sections together differently? And then this one is just about like this provision of kind of two conformance views, one that is like only looking at the profiles in core and one that also focuses on profile support and interaction support. I don't think there's an equivalent like interactions that are defined in AU base. Yeah, we'll find out, but like maybe search parameters, but like capability statements, operations, those types of like the ability to support, smart on FHIR, those types of interactions typically falls within what we call like interaction support of this level. Shall we see how this actually like plays out in let's look at the patient profile. We'll want to maybe come back to the guidance, but I think it will probably be easier to understand like how do these patterns play out if we look at how then they're applied. Let's see. Do we want to look at patient or do we want to look at like patient condition might be a little more simple? Preference? Let's see condition first, and then maybe we'll look at patient and see. I'm guessing that condition is going to be much lighter than patient, which is, yeah, okay. So base is on the left, localizes core concepts, including terminology for using Australian context, national level agreement on core localized concepts. Profile does not force conformance to it, enables implementers and modelers to make their own rules and how to support these. Whereas this one is minimum expectations to record, search, and fetch problems, diagnoses, and health concerns. It is based on the US base or AU base, identifies additional mandatory. Okay, so it's going to constrain what's in the base and potentially identify additional things that shall be present when conforming. Provides a floor for standards development for specific use cases in the Australian context. Okay. Before we get into the specific guidance, let's just take a look at the profiles side by side. So based off of the FHIR base resource, R4 condition, this one is based off of the Australian base. So these two point to each other, or this one points to this one, I should say. Which means we should probably be actually looking at the snapshot. Because it'll be carrying in anything that comes in from this as well. Actually, let's see the differential first. Code, body site, evidence is not on this. So we do have to look at snapshot or key elements, I guess. Okay. So base looks like a preferred binding on, let's take a look at this value set. So right off the bat, while that's loading, we can see like, at least for what we're seeing, they're consistent with the statement that they're not going to apply must support, they're not going to apply cardinality, and that their bindings are mostly going to be, or the differentials mostly going to be focused on applying like extensions and terminology that is contextual. This is a value set, doesn't like to be scrunched up apparently. It looks like this might be, I was trying to figure out if this is all like SNOMED CT, but it's not necessarily the Australian edition from what I'm seeing. It's just pointing to a value set that includes, a broader set of values for the purpose of exchange around that particular topic. So unless there's anything in the Australian edition in this, I read the pointer here to basically say it's our preference, and we've tried to localize condition codes to utilize SNOMED instead of some other terminology. I'm guessing that they probably have some of these that might be inclusive of their edition, but from what I can see in the definition at a high level, it looks like it's very focused on the international edition. I don't know if there's another way we can look at and confirm that, but. This is just the JSON for that value set definition that's being expanded in the web view. Yeah, it looks like just calling out the international one. Other thing to note, I'm just noting the publisher of this value set is distinct from, they're a contributor, I think, in the base, but it's a distinct steward from the base steward, which I think is HL7 Australia. I'm gonna guess we're gonna find the same things when we look at like body site and clinical findings as well. Let's see. So it looks like, in addition to saying, okay, well, we're gonna narrow the targets to maybe our preferred terminology systems, they might also have some additional like profiling in place for what should be in a value set, maybe that's Australian in nature, I guess. This one again looks to be, I'm actually kind of surprised. I don't know, Neil, others that are like terminology oriented, like,
Yeah.
is it surprising to
So-
just see the regular SNOMED CT here in these?
Not really, because I think they did leverage SNOMED International, and for their drugs, I think, or medication piece, that they have a SNOMED CT Australian extension or edition, sorry. So maybe this is the aspects we're looking at is in international, but there should be something referred to as medications that they develop themselves.
Got
Maybe
it.
underpaid. Yeah.
Well, the thing I'm curious about is like, just naturally, when we've talked about value sets for Canadian use in the past, we typically say, well, it's anything that's going to fall under this, broad exchange value set, but it's inclusive of both the international codes and our Canadian edition codes.
Yeah. I think the addition, the other aspect is we also have, French translations, and so that's why we probably have quite a distinct edition, as opposed to Australia. I think it's all in English, right? Yeah.
Oh, okay, interesting. So
Just
condition, at least from the base, seems pretty simplistic. It's just terminology. Was there someone else another comment someone had?
No, I just dropped in what the Netherlands are doing, when it comes to profiling, it's different than what is here.
Let's see. Oh, yeah. So this is the ZIBs and
ZIBs.
versus core.
Yeah, pretty lean, but
I'm gonna put it, hold on, let me just get this link. I think that this might be helpful for us to do in if there are ZIBs v core approach. Okay. Okay. So if I'm just gonna go back to base real quick. So base is on the left, core is on the right. We've got the additional, I'm gonna show differential first, and then we'll go to key elements, I guess. The application of must supports and obligations on particular elements, some places where they've applied a minimum constraint. I think they obviously add to, like they said they would, additional elements that weren't in the base to begin with. And that's like why we're seeing clinical status called out here, but not here, as well as verification status and category. Looks like, let's see if there's any constraining on, okay, code. So clinical condition. So difference here is one goes from preferred and then they go to extensible. And we're just gonna confirm it should be the same value set, but we'll just take a peek. So they're not changing. They are, for the most part, constraining and tightening the expectation on that same value set. And then there's some application of, at least in this case, invariance. So conditional rules. If a coded body site, at least one coding shall be from this, to ensure that to kind of reinforce the utilization of SNOMED CT in a different manner. Okay, clinical condition 1, I think this was the same one, yep, okay. Other things, so interesting to note, so I think we called this out to begin with, right? It's the based on the base. And however, like when the core calls it, like if it has a respective profile already established, that is what it's going to be using as its reference target. What else am I seeing? I'm seeing, doesn't look to be any, like they've defined all of the various onset options. I don't think they've constrained anything out from what is available in the base resource. I think they're just noting them. They might be preparing to make some have constraints applied to them, and that's why they're calling them out in the differential, but that's what I'm seeing right now. What else? Anyone else seeing any like key distinctions here in terms of mechanics that they're using? See if there's anything in evidence. That was the only thing I didn't see. It doesn't come up in the differential because they didn't add anything to it. But if they're basing it on the base, then it should be at least showing up somehow in the snapshot. I wonder if this is in the base spec. Yeah, so they're taking some of this from base as well. The only other thing on this page is that there's also this profile specific implementation. So if we were to look at example category, which is something they put a minimum 1 cardinality on, provides an efficient way for searching. Implementers need to understand that gated categorization is subjective. Applied elsewhere may not align. I'm just reading through this to see, like, are these like textual expectations, or are these essentially like providing context for why they made certain choices that they did. Counter code should not recognize and prepare to handle appropriately, should populate text and display so that requesters can display the condition even if the requester. So that's kind of like a textual recommendation, not a full requirement, but it's something that doesn't necessarily show up here, but they are going so far as to say, hey, part of the minimum expectation is that you should be handling some of the variety and diversity that we see in the wild. Some guidance around like active conditions should probably use this term, even though there isn't a mechanical constraint there outside of just the required binding that's in the base resource. And in that same vein, recommendations to use a particular code if a particular scenario comes to play, right? So trying to harmonize around the use of the SNOMED code when there's no known conditions. Which, again, we're not seeing that same vein in the base. I don't know if that's because it's like this would be considered use case specific, but when we look at, let's see, our condition. We've got sections that just call out, yeah, mandatory, must support. conditions pretty light. We do have other section or other profiles that have more usage notes. But you can see like we have a pretty distinct approach right now from the Australian base in that we are at minimum, we're applying must supports. And in some cases, we're also doing some slicing, but we can see if they also do slicing as well. We have only looked at one example right now. Is there anything that people, the other thing I'm seeing is, it looks like both provide examples from within the guide. So that's no major distinctions there. Anything else that people want to see on this slide before we go look at a different artifact? I'd be curious. I think we're going to see a totally different set of things that will come up for patient. So let's see, and then maybe we'll check out medication to Anil's point about like a country edition content. Let's see, patient, and let's go to patient. Okay. All right, interesting. So this one does on the base have profile specific implementation guidance, like what we looked at on core just now. So some things about guidance related to particular data types, identification of supported extensions. It looks like pointers to content in this guide and external guides. This is actually a hardware constraint, right? So this one would be kind of on par with some of the textual constraints that we saw on condition from the core in the last page, regarding how you should be populating what values and the connection between patient.gender and one of the recorded sex and gender values. And then let's see. I've got this extensions under consideration, which I think is interesting. And then comparatively, we've got gender and identity and related concepts. So this is additional implementation guidance around, I'm guessing most of these are going to be combinations of elements and extensions that like we don't necessarily see showing up here, but it's further guidance that's enforced in the core. Additional guidance that's specifically in the core. So both, I guess, house subpages around how to populate distinct elements and like workflows around that. And then while this one just said it supports these extensions, looks like this one clarifies what constraints are on those extensions and some usage scenarios on what to populate. Let's take a look at the actual differentials. Okay, so this is one that has invariance in the base. And similarly, we see this one's it is based on the AU base, and this one is based on the R4 patient. Date time shall be these the same. I think these are the exact same invariant. Well, some of these are the exact same invariants. So it looks like either they're inheriting or they're repeating these invariants, and then they're adding to them in the core. These ones are specifically around scenarios where an element or data absent reason should be present.
Hey, Sheridan.
Yep.
Do you know how they ensure that when they base core onto their base that the version is the correct version?
I think they're building through IG Publisher, so it would be defined in the implementation guide dependencies. But we can take a look at their, let me scroll down. Actually, I might have to scroll up. Let's see. It's usually like in downloads. Oops. Okay, so if we were to download their, let's just take a look at their dependencies file. So this is their implementation guide file that drives the build and where like dependent packages are claimed, a little distinct from simplifier because those you claim them like through the user interface rather than through like a file that you are manually editing. And then we've got depends on, so this is their terminology, their extension, like what the value for the extension registries they're using. Here it is. So AU base version is current. So they're using the CI build in the CI build. I'm guessing when they are doing their, we were to look at the same, let's see if they've got a formal publication. My guess is that in their formal publication, they have a version stamp in their dependencies for the base. Yep, this one. So, yep, CI builds, I guess they're keeping them up to date with each other by utilizing current. Whereas in the publication version, they're taking up a specific package that is point in time.
Okay, so I'm just thinking about, if someone were to try and use the AU core package, they would have to know kind of which dependent AU base package should also be included in whatever system that they're trying to build. Otherwise, if you have mismatched versions, it might result in unintended consequences, right?
I think the idea would be if you are downloading the, what were we in? This one is like
Let's
the
say using
preview, is
current.
that like it would port over whatever the claim was.
Mhm.
I don't know if what happens if you package and you keep something that just says current.
Mhm.
I think you kind of have to, like at the point in time of packaging, claim some dependency that the snapshot can be made off of.
Okay. Yeah, just a thought. Okay, cool. Thank you.
But like, I think there is definitely caution here, and I would actually say like, what I think the context that is in Australia that we might not necessarily share here is that they can say CI build because they like it's the same for people that are doing both, and so they know they're not going to introduce something in the base that is going to be problematic for the core to inherit. But I think that we would likely recommend folks utilize a version of the baseline that they know works, and then to like update that over time as opposed to the CI build. Because like we've even had times in our CI build where like something will slip through and it will fail. And so we don't want like kind of the not completely locked down, fully QA'd version to create problems with dependencies for other guides.
Yeah.
So something, I think it's definitely something to consider about the approach. Because
Yeah, I just also just thinking, whether if we were to do something similar or analogous in Canada, where do we want to be more explicit about the version of the base that we are deriving from
yeah,
in the profile itself?
and like what that looks like for like what we'd recommend for like a maintenance cycle over time for evaluating, updates and versions and that kind of thing. Let's see. I just want to take a look at extensions because that's the other thing that I think there's probably not a 1-for-1. So what we can see is that a bunch of extensions are defined on base. Right? And these aren't, unlike I think what we've done in baseline, where we've also socialized some extensions that are like maybe utilized in a handful of implementations, but they're also like they tend to have some use case associated with them. Like I think we've got some prescribed extensions that are very like medication dispense oriented. I think these seem to be extensions for the most part are either like kind of use case generic, or there is some here where it's like there might be some like a little bit of use cases coming in here, but they're not like constrained in. So they're not like must support, or there's not cardinality, there's no requirements around them. It looks like the majority of these extensions are either defined internationally, right? HL7.org/FHIR, or they're defined by the steward of this guide, which is HL7.org Australia. I'm seeing if they have any outside of those situations. And then maybe we'll look at the same for these extensions. So these ones that we're seeing here, Indigenous status, gender identity, individual, so they are all reprofiled from here. So they would come from the same place and just be, they're applying additional expectations. Something that I think is interesting is that like, because they've based on AU-based patient, we're going to see all of the extensions show up here. But the only ones that basically are in the differential that effectively they say there are expectations around are the ones that we've applied must supports to. So it's one of those things where I think we'll probably have to figure out how we would anticipate the baseline, like how it's mechanically going to be used. Because I know in the past we've talked about like the challenge of like rebasing from something that has extensions that you don't necessarily want. I don't know what people's thoughts are on that. So if we defined like a bunch of things, if we were to say, okay, core, there are parts of this approach that we like, we'd like you to make the base your base definition. Anything that we would introduce in terms of extensions, even if they weren't must support or minimum cardinality, would get inherited in the snapshot. The core or whatever downstream guide would just get a choice about like actually applying meaningful constraints against the ones that mean something. What do we think of the approach that we're seeing here? Are the things that we like or don't like about it? As in like defining a bunch of extensions and then potentially being the parent to a derived profile.
The kind of the one thing, and I don't think this is limited to the extensions, is publication on simplifier also complicates this because I think it hides a lot of the details of the base that it inherits from when you look at the view of, let's say, the core.
Yeah, I think that IG Publisher has kind of gone the same route recently too, where like I thought for a while they were pushing for this to be more accessible in key elements, and it is somewhat more accessible, but it also pulls in a bunch of like things from the base resource as well. So I think it's not necessarily simplifier driven. I think it's like both tools have basically said you're going to have to look through a bunch of stuff in order to see the full list of what gets inherited. from base resource and from anything you've inherited from. I guess my question is like, if it's defined and we were clear to our community that it was like, hey, just because we defined the extensions doesn't mean we have any expectations for people to implement them. And if a downstream guide if they didn't claim anything, any constraint or expectation further for those extensions in their differential, like, are we comfortable basically saying that's just an aspect of inheritance? And if the only thing that matters is if one of these extensions gets a constraint applied to it in the core or downstream guide? Does that question make sense to folks? You guys are really quiet.
Yeah, no, I'm trying to think through it, and I can see how it might be confusing for some implementations where they really don't care about that particular extension, but it shows up anyway, just because of the way that it's structured. Like if they're inheriting from, let's say, core, and they brought in all these extensions, but they're not really relevant to that specification. I can see how that might be a little bit confusing to implementers. But then I don't know how Australia has been handling it to date either, like what their reception has been.
Are there cases where you guys have like inherited from something and you're like, well, I don't really need that extension, so I'm just gonna ignore it, so it doesn't matter, like it's acceptable to, kind of leave it in the snapshot and not do anything about it in the differential if it's not something your implementation cares about?
So are we putting these extensions on an existing profile, or are we just having the extensions available in core? Because if they're just available, then you're profiling based off an existing profile which doesn't have those extensions. So you could choose to add them if you wanted to. I just wasn't sure where we were putting these extensions inside of core.
So if we were to follow suit in our baseline and define like a bunch of extensions, and then we were to ask CA Core to base itself off of baseline, then basically you could interpret that like two ways. One interpretation would be, well, everything gets inherited, and therefore like there might be downstream impacts of maybe not being able to say, don't send this extension. Or as a community, we could say, we know that while they might be available, the only thing that you really have to care about are the ones that core or a downstream guide puts a constraint around to say must support or obligation or cardinality. I don't know if there's a universal interpretation that people take. I think that like
Okay.
the risk that we have is that as a community, we don't say we are going to apply this pattern and it means this, that like we will have folks that say, oh, well, I don't agree with that extension being somewhere in the inheritance tree because I don't want to build that into my database structure, which like if we're not upfront about the fact that it doesn't have that meaning, somebody could come and say, well, that's how I interpret it. So I think it's definitely like a area that we'll have to like do some real soul searching and like documentation on, should we decide to take a similar approach. Okay. Is there anything else that people wanted to look at with extensions? I think we can probably look at their identifier, like how they're doing identifiers. If we're coming back to the topic around like how we'd want to do it in baseline in a future session. If not, let's use the 5 minutes that we have to take a peek at the next kind of interesting thing here, which is, so we can see the base in Australia doesn't do slicing. It does do data type profiles. So this is a profile for how to show an individual health identifier. And within that profile, I suppose there is slicing. That says here's how this would be modeled. You utilize extensions, and these are the values that it would be fixed, which actually I think is kind of interesting. And then it says, oh, well, you can supply any number of identifiers, and here's essentially just like the various modelings of these. So you're not forced to pick any of these because you also have the reference option of just the plain, or the data type option of just the plain identifier, which then gets inherited into core, has some obligations that are applied to it, and then what would have been specific data types are then that would be like having constraints applied to them are then like identified as slices. It's interesting. So it's a slice that goes back to this, or this, or this, or this, but it doesn't enforce every single possibility here. And the base itself doesn't call those out with slicing. It does the slicing in the data type profile, maybe because of some of the like things that we've come across ourselves with the problem of like having too much inherent like reslicing that sometimes has to occur. What do people think of that approach, where it would be like, how is the modeling in a data type profile, keeping this open, and then allow for like your core or your downstream guide to make the slices should they deem fit?
That's interesting. I wonder if that allows us to start having all the jurisdictional identifiers as data types then in a base.
Yeah, I mean, effectively, none of these are required. And it's just through the modeling that they say, here's the fixed value. So it's almost like these are examples that could then be further enforced downstream, should they be desired. It's interesting. One thing I thought was really interesting, and I pulled it up, but I probably won't have time to like really dig in. So I just wanted to show the Australia, where is it? The IPS. Thought I had it. Okay. So this isn't a formal publication yet, but this is just an example of like how they were looking at doing IPS. And I was curious about it because I wanted to know, like, how do they factor in these things like the specific slicing and reslicing and all of those things. What I think is interesting about it is that like it doesn't actually, it derives from the use case profile rather than the core. And in that way, it might allow for them to enforce these requirements, but not have them necessarily show up in a bunch of the like the structural components, so that they can keep it more pure and closer to the actual kind of IPS patient expectations. So I think it kind of like when we're evaluating like, oh, would we like this? I think we have to realize that inheritance is one potential way that these things would be carried through, but there are also additional patterns like impose that allow for a limiting of some of the impacts of some of these modeling choices. So something to explore further, and to see if there's other Australian guides that kind of have the same approach. So we've got a minute left. Like, I think we've now seen an example of, okay, how's the base have some general guidance compared to the core? We've looked at how they've applied cardinality, terminology, some slicing, some data type profiling, obligations, and must support. Is this helpful to you guys, like informing your thoughts on the matter of like where our sweet spot might be?
Yeah, I think it definitely helps put into context and helps document, what Australia has done. I think that's instructive for us to consider.
Do we want to look at our next governance call, like additional profiles to see if there's additional things that we can see? Or do we want to finish up this portion and then maybe look at the Newfoundland one or Newfoundland, the Netherlands one? Do we have a preference? Anyone?
No preference, but I wonder if there's some way we can ask maybe the folks from Australia if there's anything else that we should consider looking at, just in case we miss something significant that they've done differently or unusual.
There is anything.
You're having those kinds of conversations with other national initiatives at the working group meetings, right?
Yeah,
Sheridan?
yeah, to be like around patterning and like our approaches. But obviously the specs are evolving rapidly between the working group meetings.
Sure.
But we do have a pretty good relationship, like chat with Danielle on and off frequently. So I think I can ask her if there's other things that she'd recommend we like to tune into that might be missed in what we've reviewed so far. So let's take that approach then for our next governance. I think let's see if we can find another example that shows like how they're being leveraged, because I think we were able to look at like this piece, but not necessarily like these pieces. See if there's any follow-up here, and then maybe dig a little bit into the Netherlands example, and then maybe start to verbalize what we think our sweet spot should be.
And Sheridan, if we
Yep.
want to do the Netherlands example, do you want, if we have dedicated time, we can probably ask Ward from Simplifier to drop in, because I think he had a lot to do with that.
With the Zibs.
Yeah,
Oh, okay. I didn't actually know he worked on those.
I
Yeah,
suspect he did. He pointed me to it.
okay. There might be some other folks that are like more author oriented that we can also ask to participate. I would say maybe we follow the same approach where like we take an initial scan, we take a look at things, and then maybe we have like a particular like set of questions that we ask them to like participate around, rather so that they don't have to like see the first call of us just trying to navigate our way through the guide.
Makes sense. Yeah.
Okay. All right. Love that idea. Okay. So that in mind, we're already 3 minutes over. But I think we've got a good set of kind of next agenda items for the next set of kind of conformance calls that we have. And I think for profiling, we'll probably stay pretty focused on just changes for the near term. So I will see many of you folks next week for our profiling call. Thanks much.
Thank you.